Can a remake go too far and overcorrect the flaws of the original? All types of games are remade. Good games, bad games, games that have aged well, games that have aged poorly. Some are remade when it's only been a few years since the original release, and some are remade multiple times. Case in point, Super Mario Bros. 3. It came out in the US in 1990. Just 3 years later, it appeared again on the Super Nintendo in all its 16-bit glory. It would be remade one more time on the Game Boy Advance in 2004. This isn't the only game to get this treatment from Nintendo. Link's Awakening would get a couple remakes. Super Mario 64 would get a huge overhaul on the DS. Metroid Prime would get a remaster with new controls on the Wii, and then a significant HD upgrade on the Switch, with an optional traditional FPS control scheme. Why do this? For Super Mario Bros. 3, graphics mattered back in the day. It was a big selling point of consoles and their games. While the NES game still looks good by 1993, it might as well have been black and white compared to the colors the Super Nintendo could produce. Nintendo was going toe-to-toe with Sega, and Sonic was taking a bite out of their sales. Mario needed to be competitive. Link's Awakening was black and white before its color version was made in 1998. And the Switch version, though very loyal to the original design, did get Link to move and face in 8 directions, which does change the combat. So, there's a few reasons to do this. To bring the graphics up to modern-day standards, improve the gameplay with bug fixes and rebalances, and add new ways to play, or just tighten up some of the loose ends of the original. But there is one more way to do a remake, and that's reimagining the whole darn thing.
My name is Reggie, I'm about kicking ass, I'm about taking names, and we're about making games.
The year is 2004, and Metroid is back, baby! Metroid Prime and Metroid Fusion would sell more than 4 million units combined. Here's a fun fact. Metroid Fusion outsold Super Metroid. Chew on that for a second, will ya? For Metroid Prime, a sequel was immediately greenlit. Retro Studios would get to live and fight another day after a disastrous and tumultuous start. As for the handheld line, Sakamoto saw a renewed interest in the series, and his passion for making Metroid titles was rekindled. But what kind of Metroid game should he make next? While making Metroid Fusion, the team at R&D1 replayed the original Metroid games, and they found the first game to be obtuse and overly difficult. Sakamoto couldn't help but agree. The game was cobbled together in just 3 months back in 1986. Well, kinda. Click or tap the card to see my Metroid Zelda retrospective video for more on that story. After Metroid Fusion's release, the department head of R&D2 would retire. Nintendo would merge what was left of that software development team with R&D1. They would become their own division called Nintendo Software Planning and Development. Sakamoto would take charge of Production Group 1 in the new division. To continue the Metroid franchise, he wanted to make a game that would be a great introduction to new players. And the guys from R&D2 just spent the past half-decade remaking Nintendo and Super Nintendo Mario games for the Game Boy and Game Boy Advance. With these bits of information, the choice was obvious. The next handheld Metroid title would be a remake of the NES original. Sakamoto wanted to fix the errors that came from that rush production calendar. Plus, he wanted to add modern gameplay elements for Nintendo's new generation of players. For returning fans, he wanted to make sure they had something new to surprise and delight them. So the team added an epilogue after the Mother Brain fight. For a moment, gameplay would completely deviate to a stealth game. Samus would be stripped of her power suit, and she'd have to navigate the pirate mothership and the Chozo ruins with nothing but her stun blaster before getting a new, upgraded suit. This would act as connective tissue to explain the Varia suit's shoulder pads and some of the new equipment she gets in the later games. After that, she would tear through the space pirates before getting on a sperm-shaped spaceship and escaping. Really? That's the design of their ships? No one said no to that? Really?
Ow! 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 so graphic?
The game would be a mix of the hand-holding linearity of Metroid Fusion with the quasi-open world Super Metroid was known for. Players would have a bit more choice. A blend of Super Metroid and Metroid Fusion to show new fans of the franchise what Metroid games are all about. So, was it an overcorrection from the original? Let's take a look. Nintendo's typical development roadmap usually starts off with brainstorming gameplay ideas. What's fun and interesting? The rest of the game usually flows naturally from that. It's how we got Splatoon. Some devs were experimenting with shooting mechanics, got on a kick about ink, which led to the goal not being on the most kills but most area covered. This led to the characters being squid people diving in and out of the ink splattered on the arena, which led to the skater culture and pop art neo-grunge look. Metroid Zero Mission, being a remake, already had its ideas mostly laid out. The game mechanics and world design are already kind of set in place, but this wouldn't stop Sakamoto from wanting to rethink how the game would look and feel. The first 3 Metroid games found a lot of inspiration from Ridley Scott's film Alien. The tone, look, and atmosphere would be dark and foreboding, empty and isolating. You are a lone bounty hunter fighting against an antagonistic world out to kill you. No one is coming to save you. In space, no one can hear you scream. Super Metroid began to depart a little bit from that motif with more adventure action-oriented segments. Most of the boss fights had a high-octane score to heighten the adrenaline. Fusion really departed from the Alien aesthetic, not just with the music, but also with the art direction. It was a much brighter, more colorful game. That was mainly due to being on the original Game Boy Advance. It didn't have a backlit display, so the graphics needed to be brighter to help visibility. With Zero Mission, Sakamoto wanted to go in a slightly different direction from the original. Even though the backlit Game Boy Advance SP had been released, a large install base would still be playing on original hardware. He needed to keep the bright colors for visibility. He also wanted to add more storytelling elements while not going as far as he did with Metroid Fusion's monologues. So he gave his designers instructions to make the art look like it came out of a Western comic book. It would have a more visual distinct style while focusing on visual storytelling. High contrast, bright colors. This would make sure the graphics were still visible on the non-backlit GBAs while also keeping some of the dark elements of a high contrast noir type style. At one point, the team went a little too comic booky while being too faithful to the original Metroid design. Samus looked weird. Since Metroid sold better in the West, Nintendo of America had quite a bit of say in the project. They told Sakamoto's team, go for a more realistic design. Americans want realistic. Thank goodness for that note. Samus was redesigned to align more closely with her Super Metroid design. With the art direction settled, it's time to look at gameplay. The original Metroid was designed to break some of the conventions that Super Mario Bros. Had started back in 1985. This is what guided the moment-by-moment gameplay. Instead of being quick and agile, Samus was slow and precise. She plodded along and lacked inertia. Instead of jumping to avoid enemies, her jump itself would be an attack, and the power-ups would be permanent. They wouldn't be on a timer, and you wouldn't lose any power-ups when you took damage. Once you got the long beam, you kept it. Once you got the high jump, you kept it. This would influence the progression and map design of the game as well. Certain areas wouldn't be available unless you had the proper upgrade. They themselves became the keys that unlocked more of the map. Hiroji Kiyotake and Hirofumi Matsuoka spent almost 10 months working by themselves developing Metroid. They had given Samus a large moveset, but all those sprite animations, in addition to the enemies and backgrounds, wouldn't fit into the game's memory. When Sakamoto got involved in production, a lot had to be trimmed down and cut. What we got was a stiff moving Samus that could only fire in 3 directions. She had no crouch animation. She'd just go directly into the morph ball. There was also no map screen. Environments looked similar to each other and the beam upgrades didn't stack. So if you got the wave beam, you could more easily get low-level enemies on the ground, but you would need to swap it for the ice beam in order to progress through the game. It was kind of a pointless pickup. Samus' suit upgrades were also rather limited. For the remake, the team tackled the moving and shooting mechanics first and foremost. Since Metroid came out, Samus' shooting had seen significant overhauls. Crouching and shooting downward were added in Metroid 2. Diagonal shooting was added in Super Metroid, along with stacking of the beam upgrades. These additions would be a no-brainer in Zero Mission. They were now series staples. The bigger upgrade would be to her game feel. While she still had an almost immediate stop and start to her inertia, Samus would be snappier and more agile. She'd be given a flow to her movement. They made her move faster and her jump felt smoother and easier to control. They kept the precision while axing her weighty floatiness. They also added in wall jumping. Metroid now had crunch. As for the upgrade items, all the aforementioned item upgrades were still present, but they added in super missiles, speed booster, charge beam, plasma beam, power bombs, gravity suit, and space jump. Metroid Zero Mission would play like any of the newer Metroid games, making the game more familiar to players who may have started with Fusion or even Super Metroid. The only new item was the power grip, which enabled you to grab onto ledges like in Metroid Fusion. They also added a Zelda idea that was also present back in Super Metroid. It's kind of a Nintendo design staple. Once you get an item, you must need to use it immediately. Once you get the long beam, you must use it to get back to the main tunnel. The bombs are needed to get a missile tank and to get back to the critical path. The power grip was needed to get out of the chasm. The ice beam was needed to loop around back to the critical path, and so on and so forth. The new shooting, movement, and upgrades fundamentally changed how the game would play. It's not going to control and feel the same way that Metroid did almost 20 years ago. So that meant the map design was going to need to be overhauled as well. The original Metroid map design left a lot to be desired. Shafts and hallways felt like it took an eternity to traverse. They were way too tall and way too long. Plus, everything looked the same, and searching for the critical path could be a bit obtuse with hidden bombable blocks. And I mean hidden. There'd be little clues, if any, as to which blocks were bombable and which weren't. You just kinda had to guess, or bomb every wall and floor tile. Metroid's map opened up almost right away. You were sectioned off in a small area the first few minutes if you went right instead of left. But as soon as you got the morph ball, there was a lot of places you could go. And once you found the first missile tank, you had your choice of which upgrade to get, the bombs or the long beam. And once you got the bombs, well, Bob's your uncle. Almost the entire map is explorable. There is no right or wrong way. The only other necessary upgrade in reaching new areas was the ice beam. High jump and various suit just made things a lot easier. The map design made it very easy to get lost, overwhelmed, and dead. The game pushed back with such a force it actually disencouraged the very core idea it was designed around: exploration. This wasn't helped by the item drop system, which was random and in very small doses. When starting over after a death, it could take more than 10 or 15 minutes to farm for energy orbs and ammo to regain your strength. Adding insult to injury, once you died, the long corridors made for a very long journey back to where you were. It was arduous. It wasn't always fun. Zero Mission took the same basic layout and streamlined it. Towers and tunnels were shortened to a more reasonable length. Save rooms were added, secret rooms and areas were included, and things connected in more places to have the world fold in on itself as you upgraded your gear. A lot of this is from the changes in design with Super Metroid. The world opened up slowly, and there was a critical path that the game guided you in the first half. Even once it opened up, you really only needed to find the next section and explore there before moving on. Yeah, you had to backtrack a few times, but once you got where you needed in Norfair again, you moved onto the wrecked ship, then onto Meridia, then onto Ridley's section of Norfair before opening Turian. The game is more linear than it appears. Super Metroid would also have moments where they would trap you in an area in Norfair before really opening up the map. Zero Mission does something similar in Norfair for a moment. Metroid Fusion was a stripping down of that into the literal. You had an NPC telling you where to go and what to do. Most players didn't care too much for that. So for Zero Mission, the developers took some of Super Metroid's map design philosophy and incorporated it into their design philosophy, hence the Chozo hint statues. Let's spend a moment talking about that hint system. This idea was endemic of the times and heavily influenced by that era's design trends combined with handheld gaming behaviors of the early aughts. I understand some view the hints as anti-Metroid, so to speak, but you have to remember, the team had a different philosophy back then. At least in this iteration, the hints were given in a way that flowed naturally with how a Metroid game is typically laid out. Let's take a look. The start is just like Metroid. Same area, same location for the morph ball, and it progresses very similarly. But they added some things. The long beam is now a necessary item. You're trapped in this small beginning area until you get it. In a neat bit of environmental storytelling, you are guided to the Kraid and Ridley statues, showing you the end goal. It's a very important area you'll have to remember for later. The game then dumps you back in the main hallway to use the long beam to get to the next section. The opening moment of the game shows you an obstacle, guides you to the key, and leaves breadcrumbs for you to follow to go off the path a bit to show you something important. While veteran players will know this instinctively, new players are just taught the way forward is sometimes backwards, and it won't always be on the map. You'll have to discover it for yourself. This is done on a larger scale when you go to Norfair for the first time. After getting the bombs in Brinstar, there's an area you pass through that you'd be enticed to use your newfound ability. Maybe there's something down there like a missile or energy tank. Instead, you get a hint marker. But when you get there, you can't go straight to that marker. You have to go the opposite direction. Find the power grip, loop back around to Norfair to finally progress to the ice beam. And once you get the ice beam, you're forced to move forward to loop back around to the main hallway, where you're enticed to enter a room that is too hot for you until you get the Varia suit. So you've learned a few things: how the power grip works, how to use the ice beam, how the world continuously folds in on itself, and there's a new obstacle you're going to need to get an upgrade for. The game is full of these vignette moments. We see it again in Kraid's lair with activating the sliders. We see it again in Norfair with a speedball launcher. The micro-level area design is really solid. It's clever and acts like a bit of its own lock and key system. The endgame happens after the epilogue when you acquire the improved suit that activates the previously incompatible upgrades. In one go, you get the gravity suit, plasma beam, space jump, and then you get the power bombs in the Chozo ruins. With this last upgrade, you can bomb the glass tube, just like in Super Metroid, and do a victory lap around Zebes, getting the tank upgrades that were previously inaccessible. It's a fun victory lap to end the game on. On the surface, Zero Mission appears to be very linear like Fusion, but that's not the case. First run-throughs will follow a straightforward progression, designed as intended. But for the die-hard Metroid lover, the more you explore and poke and prod, the more you'll discover. Metroid Zero Mission does something purposely that Super Metroid kind of stumbled into: sequence breaking. Want to skip the long beam and go straight to the bombs? Shoot out these blocks and off you go. Want to get the high jump right after getting the ice beam? Get good at wall jumping and use this secret shaft to go straight to the boots. And that shaft is kind of telegraphed with this flying guy. You just learn you can use them to freeze to get to certain areas and certain secrets. Everything has a purpose in this level design. Nothing is truly random. They purposely designed the remake to be broken. It's baked right in. In Metroid Fusion, they took it out. The bombs were retimed to disable bomb jumping. In some areas, you were locked out of just because. In Metroid Zero Mission, they brought it back in. So if you learn the map layout and get good at using Samus's natural abilities like wall jumping and bomb jumping, you can break the sequence and do it your way. They gave you two ways to play the game: as designed, or with a lot of freedom. Let's come back to this video's opening question. Did Metroid Zero Mission overcorrect for the flaws of the original? Let's all face it, Metroid aged terribly. It was obsolete the moment Super Metroid came out, which you could argue was a quasi-remake back in 1994. If there are arguments to be made for a game remake, Metroid has plenty. Despite its many flaws though, people loved the game. It was popular enough for Mother Brain to be a villain in the Nintendo-themed cartoon Captain N, the Game Master.
You're out of time, too! One human alone could never beat me!
Can someone explain to me why she sounds like Audrey 2 from Little Shop of Horrors? Once again though, is this an overcorrection? Mark Brown from Game Maker's Toolkit makes a very strong case that this is an overcorrection. And he has a compelling argument, referencing the role of player choice in Metroid games and the thrill of finding your way after being lost for a time. To be honest, I'm inclined to agree with him, but I also find the criticism to be a little short-sighted. No offense, Mark, I love your work, man. Mad respect. In this series, I've liked to try to view games in light of the circumstances in which they are made, and the era in which they are made in. It's why I call the original Metroid game a friggin' miracle. If you know the story, it's amazing that the game is even playable. It just goes to show the extreme talent within Nintendo even at the dawn of this industry. So how does this apply to Zero Mission? I'm not going to fall back on the handheld philosophy here. I could, but I've already made my point with Metroid Fusion, and I briefly mentioned it in this video as well. This was the handheld team, and they had a certain design philosophy. But there are two other reasons why Zero Mission is more handholdy than its NES predecessor: the stated target audience and the current design trends of the era. In a 2004 interview, Yoshio Sakamoto talked about why he wanted to remake Metroid. Many players' first exposure to the world of Metroid was through Metroid Fusion. And with Metroid Zero Mission, I wanted to give those players a taste of what an older Metroid game was like. That is, an action game with a higher degree of freedom. To do that, I knew I'd need to update the original Metroid's gameplay, story, and world. The target demographic for Nintendo players in the GameCube, Game Boy Advance era was between 8 and 13. Most of their audience were born at least 4 to 5 years after Metroid came out. As game design evolved and matured, there were certain expectations in accessibility and difficulty. This wasn't the 80s anymore. A lot of designers had better sensibilities. This was the audience that would be buying Metroid Zero Mission. Not all of them were going to need the hand-holding, but quite a few would drop off too quickly if the game didn't guide them along in a way they understood. Even older gamers wanted that. 10 years earlier, Super Metroid was doing just that, granted, without the obvious hint markers. That guide was designed more organically into the map design and gameplay. But this leads to another reason: the trends of the time. Game design philosophy was maturing and getting iterated on. Developers now had a few decades of best practices and the data to back those up. Plus, games in the late 90s and early 2000s were getting more complicated. Just look at how controllers changed and evolved since the NES. The NES gamepad had a total of 8 inputs. The home consoles of the 2000s had 11 to 16 inputs with analog control sticks and analog triggers for more variables. 3D games were getting complicated, and opening section tutorials were becoming the norm to replace the game manual. Being given clear and direct objectives was expected. At the very least, Zero Mission introduced them and twisted on them in a way that made sense for a Metroid game. The first 2 hints showed you exactly where to go. Get the long beam, then go get the bombs. The third objective is the ice beam, but as I mentioned earlier, you have to go the opposite direction first. The next objective points you to the speed booster, and it's nowhere near as straightforward as the long beam, bombs, or even the ice beam and its deviation. The markers get harder to reach, and it requires more exploration to find the path. I personally don't view this as detrimental to the design. It gave a boost to those who even found Super Metroid to be a bit obtuse. I'm going to admit something here. There is a very heavy personal bias in this. Zero Mission is my personal favorite entry in the Metroid franchise. I come back to this game on the regular. As I was playing it for this episode, my wife asked me, "Is this your comfort game? You play it a lot." And yeah, it is. Part of that is because of the length of the game. It's pretty short and easy to complete. There's not much of a time commitment there. The other part is I really like how the game is laid out. It fixes everything that's wrong with the original and adds the best parts of Super Metroid to the design. It does hold your hand quite a bit at the start, but the markers become more and more difficult to find as the game progresses. It's not the straight shot some make it out to be. Zero Mission takes everything wrong with Metroid and corrects it while also adding a lot of new ideas to make the experience fresh and novel. While there are legitimate arguments that the design philosophy of the day led to an overcorrection, I can't help but disagree. It's a great entry point for anyone coming to the franchise for the first time, and for returning players, there's a lot there to unpack and unlock to be able to play the way you want to play.